Have you ever gone out to the garden on a summer evening and suddenly stopped in your tracks? Have you ever seen small holes in the leaves and wondered when that happened? Have you ever believed that taking measures just one more time would make everything fine? And a few days later, upon finding similarly damaged leaves or weakened plants, again, have you ever felt disappointed, wondering what that sense of relief was all about? Have you ever felt that while the time you spend tending the garden is increasing, the time you spend gazing at it and feeling relieved is decreasing? Have you ever wondered why, even though you are supposed to be taking action repeatedly, you always end up seemingly chasing after things? The evening light loses the intensity of the day and softly envelops the entire garden. A little of the day's heat still remains on the soil, and the leaves sway quietly every time the wind passes. From a distance, it is a peaceful scene of a home vegetable garden. However, if you step a little closer and look carefully, it has a different expression. Fine bite marks remaining on the surface of the leaves, seedlings that have lost a little vigor, plants where the way the fruit is setting seems somewhat unnatural. It is an accumulation of small feelings of wrongness that only the person standing in the garden notices. And for many people, that small sense of wrongness immediately evokes the next memory. It is that feeling of, is the same thing starting all over again? I too repeated that cycle for years. When I found damage, the first thing I did was spray something. I tried to deal with it as quickly as possible, thinking, this should settle things down. For that moment, I could feel a little relieved, because I felt that I had taken proper action, that I had protected the garden. But that relief does not last long. A few days later, or perhaps a week or two later, holes are found on another leaf. An anomaly appears on another plant. Even if it is not exactly the same as before, I eventually return to the same kind of disappointment. I am made to realize that the garden's problem had not disappeared. It had merely moved slightly out of sight. What is truly painful is not the fact that holes are made in the leaves itself. As long as we are growing things in nature, most people understand that there is no such thing as a garden where absolutely nothing happens. Even so, the reason our hearts grow tired is because no matter how much effort we put in, it feels like the root cause hasn't changed. Even though the effort and time increase, the garden doesn't become any easier. Even if we can act on the spot every time, it always feels like we are chasing from behind. When that happens, the garden ceases to be a place of healing and becomes a place that reminds us of problems yet to be resolved. Even though we planted for the season with anticipation, our feelings are pulled toward vigilance and confirmation rather than the joy of growing. Amidst such repetition, I gradually began to doubt. Perhaps what was lacking was not strong countermeasures. Perhaps the reason I was always lagging behind was that I only thought about the problem after the holes appeared in the leaves. When I started thinking that way, a different perspective emerged. Pests do not arrive suddenly for no reason. Perhaps somewhere in the garden, there are reasons that make it easy to find reasons that make it easy to settle in, and conditions that make it easy to multiply. If so, reacting only after the damage becomes visible will always keep me one step behind. I began to feel strongly that perhaps I was only chasing the visible symptoms and had not noticed the signals the garden itself was giving. That thought wasn't born suddenly one day. It only gradually took shape after repeating the same seasons many times and looking at other gardens. Among them, there are gardens that, while not completely devoid of insects, look mysteriously calm. Even if there is some damage to the leaves, there is no atmosphere of having to frantically deal with it every week. There is a certain stable quietness throughout the entire garden. Every time I saw such a garden, I wondered why it was different. I began to think that the difference might lie not in what is sprayed, but in what kind of garden it has become. The expression of the soil, the way the wind passes through, the way things are planted, the scents, perhaps all of those things layer together to create the result. And I finally realized, perhaps the important thing is not just what to do after pests appear. What we truly need to consider is why that garden became easy to find and easy to approach from the very beginning. If that changes, the painful game of catch-up every year might gradually be brought to an end. The answer might not be in a spray you can easily pick up, but hidden within the very nature of the garden itself. For a while, I thought there was only one problem in the garden. That was the appearance of insects. If a leaf was chewed, I would do something about that insect. If a seedling weakened, I would remove the visible cause. Come to think of it, it is a very natural way of thinking. In fact, the first action many people take in a home vegetable garden should be close to that. Reacting to what is happening right in front of you. Taking action when damage is visible. I cannot go so far as to say that method is wrong. At the very least, it has the power to ease anxiety in that moment. However, after repeating the same seasons for years, you realize that peace of mind does not last long. And each time I gradually began to harbor a different question. Is the fact that insects were present truly the only problem? Isn't the bigger problem why they can return so easily every time? If the garden immediately suffers the next wave of damage, even after you have taken action, once it might be because you merely reduced the visible insects, while the conditions of the garden itself haven't changed at all. When I started thinking that way, the garden I had been looking at began to look a little different. The holes and bite marks on the leaves were merely the result. Wasn't there something progressing more quietly before that? Perhaps what I had been chasing every time was only the part that finally took visible form. Such thoughts grew stronger. Many people try to solve garden problems through reaction, acting when damage occurs, thinking when they find an insect, finally starting to worry about the base of the plant or the underside of the leaves only after the leaves are damaged. I was like that for a long time too. That approach seems very rational on the spot. However, in nature, that tends to always be a delayed response. At the point when damage becomes visible, it is possible that the insects have already entered the garden, settled there, and begun utilizing some kind of condition. In other words, thinking after seeing a hole in a leaf means you are following behind a flow that had already begun. What greatly changed my thinking here was the perspective that insects do not come by chance. Previously, I thought insects just flew around the surroundings and happened to find the garden. But in reality, it is not that simple. Pests each have clues for finding crops and environments that suit them. Some react to smells, while others are drawn by the shape of the leaves or how they are planted. Some prefer places where the soil is exposed and it is easy to hide, while others choose conditions where it is easy to lay eggs. In short, while a garden is a place for humans to grow vegetables for insects, it is like a map packed with a lot of information. If that map is easy to read, insects will approach without hesitation. Conversely, if the signals are blurred, it takes time for them to find it, and they might move to another location along the way. After realizing this, the meaning of pest control changed for me. Rather than looking for strong substances, I began to think about how to make the garden difficult to find. I began to think about what is necessary to make it hard to live in, and what should be changed to make it hard to multiply in. This seems the same, but it is a completely different approach. The former way of thinking tries to erase the problem after it has occurred. The new way of thinking tries to create an environment where problems are unlikely to take root in the first place. With the former, humans are always chasing behind. With the latter, the garden itself quietly begins its defense. One morning, while looking at a well-tended garden, I strongly felt that difference. There was nothing particularly flashy there, but looking closely, the way the ground was treated, the way things were planted, the expression of the edges of the garden, everything pointed in a single direction. The empty spaces were not unnecessarily exposed. The crops were not merely lined up. The entire landscape had layering rather than monotony. To insects, that layering meant difficulty in entering, and to humans, it meant calmness. It was then that I finally understood. Perhaps a single strong method is not always necessary to protect a garden. The important thing might be accumulating numerous small disadvantages, making it a place that is no longer comfortable for insects. That system does not rely on a single decisive factor. It gains power through the layering of multiple tiers. Even if one wall is not enough, if several walls continue, it becomes much harder to pass through. The garden is the same. Rather than reducing insects completely to zero, you stop the flow, where insects easily settle, and easily multiply multiple times along the way. By doing so, people won't have to frantically run around every time. When I understood that even the way the soil beneath my feet looked changed, because I realized that the place I previously felt was just a pathway, might actually be the first line of defense. After I began to view the garden not as a collection of disjointed furrows, but as a single system, I realized that the first line of defense is not on the leaves, but at our feet. That is the surface of the soil. Previously, I considered the ground between the plants merely as empty space. It was a place to walk, a place to pull weeds when they appeared, and a place to lightly level occasionally to keep things looking tidy. However, looking closely exposed, soil is by no means a blank space where nothing is happening. It absorbs heat, changes how moisture is retained, invites weeds, and in some cases, quietly supports the flow of many small living creatures. Although people overlook it, various things have already begun there. Once I started thinking that way, I began to pay attention to how to treat the surface of the soil. Covering the ground with organic matter, like straw-dried grass or fallen leaves, is not simply to soften the appearance. When the soil is exposed under strong sunlight, the entire garden gives off a somewhat tense impression. But when the surface is covered, that atmosphere changes slightly. The retention of moisture settles down, the momentum of weeds is suppressed, and the expression of the soil becomes softer. An inconspicuous quietness is born in the lower half of the garden. I do not consider this an all-powerful method. It is not a single answer for every crop and every pest. Depending on the crop, it is also necessary to adjust it while observing the situation. Even so, when considered as part of the overall system, I came to understand that this way of treating the ground surface changes the very nature of the garden. When gazing at a garden where the ground is firmly covered, the way the crops look mysteriously changes as well. What previously looked like vegetables dotted across the soil gradually begins to look connected as a single space. Rows of tomatoes, squash plants, and furrows of leafy greens no longer seem merely exposed and lined up, but appear to naturally settle upon a soft, calm ground. That change is not just about appearances. There is a sense that the entire garden is somehow no longer exposed, transforming from a simple, easily readable place to a slightly complex, difficult-to-penetrate place. Through that change, I deeply felt that conspicuous things alone are not enough for the garden's defense. The lowest layer, which the eye is most prone to overlook, becomes the very first foundation. However, if asked whether preparing the ground at our feet is enough, the answer is no. If the first line of defense is on the ground, the next defense is needed on the outside of the garden, that is at the boundary, where the garden and its surrounding space meet. What strongly drew my heart here was that the less damage a garden has, the less monotonous the expression of its outer perimeter is. The edge of the garden is neither empty nor rigidly demarcated. There, fragrant plants continue unbroken, surrounding the garden like a soft band. Rather than being placed slightly for decoration, they appeared to exist there with a purpose. In my early days, I thought of fragrant plants like basil chives and marigolds as touches of color for the garden. Fun to look at, pleasant smelling, adding a little atmosphere. I thought of them only to that extent. However, I gradually came to understand that they are not just that. A garden where the smell of the crops flows straight outside might easily become a very recognizable place for insects. Conversely, when various scents overlap on the outer perimeter of the garden, the air at that boundary changes. When it's not just the scent of basil, but the sharpness of chives, the softness of lavender, and the unique presence of marigolds mingling together, it feels as if the very outline of the garden blurs. What is important is not placing just one plant. Only when there is density, continuity, and diversity does it become a wall of scent, rather than a decoration. I began to think of this outer band as something like an invisible curtain. It doesn't shut anything out completely. It doesn't disconnect the garden from nature. However, it seems to have the function of quietly conveying to those approaching the garden through it that this is not an easily readable place. Every time the wind passes, numerous scents mingle, making the entrance to the garden much more ambiguous than before. Then the garden transforms from a collection of simple landmarks into a space with a little depth. Every time I felt that change, I was made to realize how significant the impression seen from the outside is. The first morning, I actually tried creating a band of scent around a small plot. I felt the difference in the air before even seeing the results. There was a layered presence there that wasn't the scent of any single specific plant. It felt as if an invisible gate had been created in the garden. It is not closed, but it is a gate you cannot enter straight through. And when the ground was prepared, and a soft defense was born on the outside as well, I finally began to understand. This is still just the entrance. What is truly important is to complicate the signals even further inside those furrows, right beside the crops. As the soil at our feet settles, and a band of scent forms on the outside of the garden, the entire garden ceases to be a place that simply offers everything straight to the outside as it did before. However, it doesn't end there. Simply softening the outer outline is not enough to fully protect it. If insects cross over that and enter inside even smaller contrivances, become necessary within the furrows. It was there that I first began to view things like mixed planting and companion plants with different eyes than before. Previously, whenever I heard that it was good to plant a certain plant near another, I braced myself a little. Would I have to memorize all the combinations of what to plant with? What would I have to drastically rearrange the entire garden? Thinking so made the concept feel somewhat distant. However, the essence that actually came into view was much simpler. It is about not placing crops one by one in a clearly readable form. It is about complicating the information within the garden slightly by adding plants with different scents, different shapes, or different presences, right next to the main vegetables. Just doing that changes the impression of the furrow significantly. Once I started thinking that way, mixed planting ceased to be a difficult technique. Rather, it began to feel like the work of placing quiet watchmen throughout the garden. For example, just adding a little basil near the tomatoes changes the air. That place is no longer just for tomatoes. Try putting members of the onion or garlic chive family in the gaps between the furrows or in empty spaces. Their slender forms create a different rhythm in the garden. None of them require a large area. What is important is not the quantity, but where and how to blend them in. Just having another distinct presence beside a crop changes how readable that location is, after realizing that the way I saw the garden changed considerably. My previous garden was very distinct, furrow by furrow. It gave the impression of having signs lined up that read, "Here are tomatoes. Here is squash. Here are leafy greens." It is easy for a person to understand, and seems easy to manage for the grower. However, it might have also been an easily understandable place for insects. As you gradually insert other plants there, that simplicity breaks down. Even in the same tomato furrow, a different scent mixes and a different leaf shape enters, and the impression when approaching becomes one step more complex. I felt this change was very important. There is no need to hide the garden. You just have to make it not too easy to read. What I like about this method is that it does not make the garden look unnatural. I do not want to make a garden where only rules stand out too much. I believe a garden is a living space, something created as each plant holds its role little by little, forming the same place together. The basil near the tomatoes has a soft familiarity. When members of the onion or chive family mix in, a crisp outline is added to that place. Just by introducing such a different presence near crops that are easily targeted by pests, the furrow is no longer a simple straight line. Watching that, I feel as if numerous narrow alleys are born within the garden, and the air in each alley is slightly different. Moreover, the good thing about this contrivance is that you can start without redoing the entire garden from scratch. There is no need to redraw a grand blueprint. You can just start little by little from the empty spaces in your current furrows. Put basil at the end of the tomato row. Insert onions between furrows. Add a few plants with different scents and expressions to places that feel somewhat monotonous. Each of these acts is very modest. However, as they overlap here and there in the garden, the overall impression reliably changes. The garden becomes a place where numerous small considerations quietly work rather than just a place where crops are lined up. At this stage, I finally realized that mixed planting is neither a decoration nor a minor trick, but wisdom meant to make the garden difficult to read. In nature, the easier something is to read, the easier it is to find, and the harder it is to read, the less easily it is exploited. Walking between the furrows in the morning light, I felt as though the garden was gradually beginning to speak a different language. It hadn't become noisier than before. It had just ceased to be simple. A depth was born in the garden, making it impossible to guess at a glance what was where. And as that depth increased, another change was quietly beginning. Not only was the garden difficult for pests to find, but it was beginning to become a much more comfortable place for certain living creatures than before. I did not yet fully understand their presence at that time, but I would soon learn that they were vital allies supporting the garden. As the structure of the garden gradually changed, I finally began to notice something I had overlooked for a long time. It was the fact that there are not only pests in the garden. Previously, I always thought of what happened in the garden as a one-on-one relationship between myself and the pests. I felt it was an either-or situation, whether I could prevent them or not, whether I could drive them away or not. However, the actual garden was not that simple. There are those that eat leaves, and there are those that eat them. There are those that gather in weakened spots, and there are those that work so they don't multiply excessively there. Even though the garden was amid an exchange of far more lives right from the start, I hadn't been seeing even half of it. One morning, while walking slowly between the furrows, I felt this clearly. Near a stem, a small ladybug was perched perfectly still. Around the small flowers I had left at the edge of the garden, slender, swift insects darted back and forth in the light. Near the surface of the ground, too, there were movements I had previously thought of merely as shadows. When I crouched down and looked, there were living creatures fulfilling their respective roles without me even noticing. From that moment, the garden was no longer just a place where vegetables and pests faced each other. It was a more complex place where mutual help was occurring much more quietly. When my perspective changed in this way, the weaknesses of my previous methods also became visible. Spraying recklessly and widely does not only affect the pests right in front of you. Sometimes it simultaneously drives away the allies that were there. Ladybugs are not merely cute existences. Tiny parasitic wasps are not there meaninglessly just because they are inconspicuous. Green lacewings and small predators moving on the ground surface are the same. Before a person even notices, they find eggs, larvae, and weakened clusters and quietly keep their numbers in check. Whether or not that function exists greatly changes the air of the garden. I finally came to understand that the difference between a garden where you panic every week and a garden that can gradually recover is also supported by the presence of these small allies. Here, I also reconsidered how to keep the garden tidy. Previously, I thought a neatly organized garden was the ideal. I felt it was better if the edges were perfectly aligned, there were no unnecessary things, and the ground was clear. However, I learned that such overly tidy gardens are sometimes gardens with few places for allies to stay. Without small flowers, there is no place for adult beneficial insects to gather nectar and pollen. Without places to hide, they cannot stay calmly. Even a few fallen leaves or softly left edges can become important places for the small lives living there. Cleaning the garden is not a bad thing. It's just that when you try to uniform everything too much, while the garden becomes easier for humans to see, it can sometimes become a difficult place for allies to live in. Therefore, I changed my methods just a little bit. I started leaving small flowers near the furrows, not just for appearances, but for the living creatures that stop by there. I stopped trimming parts of the garden edges as tightly as before. I left a little softness. Of course, this does not mean I neglect the entire garden, nor do I want to increase messy areas. I simply stopped trying to manage everything in the exact same way. With that small change, more signs of life returned to the garden than before. Then, mysteriously, the impression of the garden changed. Although it was just as quiet, it was a different quietness from before. Perhaps before, it was quiet because there was nothing there. But the current quietness is a calm quietness overall, even though various living creatures are moving in their respective places. Small flowers were no longer mere decorations, but became places to anchor allies. Every time I walked between the furrows, I gradually came to understand. What is needed is not a garden with absolutely no insects. What is truly needed is a garden where pests alone do not gain a one-sided advantage. That difference was greater than I had thought. The way the seasons progress itself is different between a garden that tries to push back from the outside every time something happens, and a garden that has begun to possess the power to quietly support itself from within. Because even if I don't chase after things, every time the things maintained within the garden gradually increase. It doesn't change overnight like magic, but it certainly becomes less fragile than before. The surface of the soil settles. There is a layer of scent on the outside. There are contrivances of mixed planting within the furrows, and on top of that, small allies are quietly patrolling. When things are set up to that point, the foundation of the garden is pretty much established. What remains is not the daily focus, but strictly a final supplement, a backup measure to gently lend a hand only when something inevitably slips in becomes necessary. Reaching this point, I finally came to clearly understand something I had hardly considered before. A healthy garden is not a garden where all signs of insects have completely disappeared. A healthy garden is a garden that does not immediately collapse greatly, even if something happens. The ground surface is calmly protected. There is a layer of scent on the outside. Other plants quietly mix into the furrows, and within that whole inconspicuous allies fulfill their respective roles. Once things are arranged to that extent, what remains at the end is not the foundation, but a backup measure. No matter how much you prepare, something will slip in. However, I finally began to understand that what is needed then is not an exaggerated reaction, but a small supplement, so as not to destroy the already existing system. Previously, the moment I found damage, I thought I had to do something as quickly and as strongly as possible. I felt that if I didn't deal with it in a hurry, the entire garden would become irretrievable. But I do not think so now. If numerous defenses have been built in the garden, the final response should be quieter. Look only at the necessary places. Lend a hand only as much as needed. By doing so, you can avoid shaking the entire garden. I feel this difference is very profound. With my previous method, tension ran through the entire garden every time something happened. But now, even if the same problem occurs, I can first calmly look at the whole picture, because the foundation is already there. Within such a mindset, there are times when I use homemade supplementary methods. I sometimes prepare a small amount of a simple mixture using garlic or chili peppers and gently apply it only to the areas of concern. This is when small pests that tend to gather on the undersides of leaves increase, or when I want to suppress them at a stage before they spread. The important thing is not to treat it like an all-out attack aimed at the entire garden. Not scattering it widely out of frustration, but quietly touching only the places with problems, and then taking a little distance to observe the garden's reaction. Depending on the need, I might use supplements like neem, but again, it is meaningless unless used upon the same mindset. Avoiding the hours when beneficial insects are active and ensuring not to destroy the balance already existing in the garden. That becomes the premise. The goal here is not to eradicate everything, but to readjust the flow. This difference changed my very stance in facing the garden. Previously, every time a problem occurred, I was pulled along solely by that single incident. If a hole opened in a leaf, I could only see that hole. If a plant looked weak, I was only concerned about that weakness. Because I was always acting on the spot, I didn't have the leeway to see what direction the entire garden was heading. However, after learning the concept of multi-layered defense, my perspective became slightly higher. The condition of the ground, the atmosphere of the outer perimeter, the combinations within the furrows, the movements around the small flowers. I became able to feel that all of these things connect to create a single garden. Once that happens, even if damage occurs, I am not swallowed by anxiety as quickly as before. Because I know that even if there is a problem in one spot, the garden as a whole already has the power to support itself. Looking back, the major difference lay in two approaches to gardening. One is the method of chasing after things once they happen. Thinking after holes appear, panicking after vigor is lost, and reacting immediately with whatever is at hand. The other is the method of giving the garden support before things happen, not leaving the soil exposed, not creating a monotonous boundary on the outside, mixing different presences into the furrows, not losing the margins where allies can remain. In the latter, there is no longer a need for me to carry everything and run around, because the garden itself gradually becomes able to protect itself. A person only needs to lend a hand there. And what was greatest of all for me was that my feelings upon stepping out into the garden changed. Previously, every time I set foot in it, the first thing I did was look for bad signs. Where has been hit? What is spreading? What do I have to do next? Only such things came to mind. Even though I liked the garden, I was somewhat tense. But it is different now. Of course, I still observe carefully now and act if necessary. But what I feel first is calmness rather than anxiety. There is a defense on the ground, a layer of scent on the outside, contrivances within the furrows, and small allies quietly moving among them. Just being able to think that makes the garden a much more reliable place than before. In the end, the biggest thing I learned was that gardening is not about completely controlling nature. It is not about leaving not a single insect, nor is it about reducing damage to zero. The important thing is to prepare numerous supports within the garden so that the flow of nature does not tilt one-sidedly into a disadvantage. There is no perfect garden. There is no season where nothing happens. Even so, if there are softly layered defenses, a person doesn't always have to stand in the garden as if being chased. You can once again reclaim the time to watch the evening light fall on the leaves and the time to listen to the sound of the wind crossing the furrows. The quiet joy I felt when I first started the garden had not disappeared. It had merely been hidden by the accumulation of hasty reactions. And if you change your perspective, the garden will gradually begin to return a different kind of answer.